Yes, I talked before about the African identity, the importance of it. It isn't just about recognising the past. To a great extent, it helps to educate. You say you're black, all you need to do is look in a mirror and you can see you're black. It's just a generalised description of your skin colour, nothing more. But when you say you're African, particularly if you were born in the Caribbean like you and I were, you have to answer the question, how could I be an African when I was born in the Caribbean?
Mm-hmm.
Then you also have to ask, well, okay, how did I get to be
In
in
the
the
Caribbean.
Caribbean?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to ask the question, okay, what is it about me that is African, that is recognisably so? Is there anything about me that's African?
Mm-hmm.
And when you answer those questions, that's when you find out about the importation of Africans from the continent, slavery. That's when you find out about the African culture that's around you every day
Every
in the
day,
Caribbean
yeah.
that you never realised.
That you never even
saw
connected
before.
to, yeah.
That's then how you recognise or you see all of the problems that occurred through slavery and the ignorances and the prejudices and that sort of thing. By asking that simple question, am I African? And finding the answers to that, which you have to do. And to a great extent, that's the power of the identity. And people will say, well, okay, how can you be African? Because Africa's a continent.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of different cultures and civilizations on the continent. How can you be African in that sense? Well, there are two things. One, during slavery and colonialism, Europeans divided up the African continent. The Conference of Berlin, where they met together around a table to think, how can we in a civilized way divide up this continent between ourselves? Of course, there are no Africans there, but lots of European nations. And they developed borders and cut countries up. They sliced cultural communities in half and so on. This bit goes to France, this bit goes to Belgium, this bit goes to England and so on.
And so on, yeah.
So fighting against that wasn't a Yoruba thing, an Asante thing, a Fon thing. It was an African thing because it affected the entire continent, north, south, east and west. And challenging European supremacy became an African struggle. In the Caribbean, they deliberately divided African communities up. So you'll find, for example, in Cuba, a strong Yoruba presence. But you'll also find that in Trinidad.
Oh, right.
You'd find in Jamaica a strong Asante presence. And you'd also find that in places like Barbados and so on. You find in places like Haiti a strong sort of like Fon presence. You find Bantu people scattered across
All
the
over.
Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
The theory being that if you divide up these communities, they would find it harder to work together and band together to attack the plantations. But of course, Africa as a continent is used to being surrounded by neighbours who speak different languages, have different religious or cultural practices, just like the difference between Britain and on continental Europe. Whereas in this country, if you speak anything other than English, they have a problem with you. But in continental Europe, you regularly find people who can speak 2 or 3 or 4 different languages because they're neighbours and they're always interacting. So the Africans managed to get over it. They got together and they worked together, even though they're from different cultural communities. So what we have in the Caribbean is not a Yoruba or a Asante, a Fon or whatever. You have an African thing. Because the communities came together, found commonalities, and worked together to fight against slavery, to fight against the European oppression kind of thing. So the African identity is a political identity that came out of the problems of colonialism and slavery, but also is a very powerful tool to combat that, both individually, as a person in yourself, as I mentioned before, the identity, but also generally, because if we look in the 1960s, and people in the 19s talk about the 60s and freedom struggles, they always talk about the civil rights movement. No, the real struggle for freedom and independence was on the African continent itself, where liberation forces in Ghana, in Guinea-Bissau, in Guinea, in Kenya, across the African continent were fighting to free themselves from European colonialism. They'd fought for their European countries during the Second World War. They saw what Hitler did to those European countries. They saw how those European countries fought against Hitler, who was trying to colonize their nations. Then they went back home and found that they were suffering still in their countries, being colonized by the Europeans. And they fought against that. And we saw this rise in the liberation struggles from, Ghana back in the late 50s with Kwame Nkrumah to other nations and so on. But there were people in the Caribbean as well who were also engaged in that struggle, helping them, African people, in this country, in Britain. and in North America. So whilst the civil rights movements were fighting to drink from a water fountain or sit on the front seat of a bus, people in the African continent and around the world were fighting to liberate entire nations. They were fighting against sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 different armies and so on. So we see this as an international struggle to actually gain that independence. And as Nkrumah says, that when you liberate Ghana, it's not about liberating Ghanaians. We're saying to Europeans, if you want to deal with this in the future, you have to think again about how you deal with the African heritage people in your country. So we're liberating Africa so that we have a stronger position, if you like, for African people worldwide. So that is the importance of the African identity on so many different levels, and why it's so strong in relation to combating the problems that we have. So I always say that if you want to deal with these issues, the first thing you have to do is to come to terms with that identity and see what it really means and examine it. And it will open your eyes to so many other things as a result of it.